Hi there, this is just a lecture on how to read a scientific historical paper. And what you notice in this class is because we're talking about sustainability, a lot of our information about sustainability isn't necessarily coming from written text, it's coming from scientific information like pollen counts, charcoal counts, tree rings, and so on. So this week I'm having you read a paper on pollen and charcoal counts, and I want to go through it just to make sure you understand how to read all the data, because if you remember for your podcast assignment, you need to use scientific data when you're presenting your information. So let me switch views here. So this is the article I'm having you read. Alexandria's Eastern Harbor, Egypt, pollen, microscopic charcoal, and a transition from natural to human modified basin. It's by Stanley and Bernhardt. And then here's all the bibliographic information, the name of the journal, the year, the volume, and then the specific page numbers. So let me go down here. Now what I did was, and I'll upload this particular paper for you in the weeks folder, is I've started to highlight things. It's partly for me to remember what I need to talk about right in this lecture. And the other one is to highlight what I think are the important parts. And I've already given you a lecture on how to start off reading an article by looking at the abstract, read a bit of the introduction, go directly to the conclusion. If it sounds like it's still something you want to use, then go back and read the entire thing. So I've highlighted the word abstract. Now, not all articles have this, but this particular one does. And all an abstract does is it pretty much tells you what the article is about. So you can read in this first sentence, and I won't be reading this to you, this whole thing, obviously. But the first part, pollen and microscopic charcoal examined in the Holocene sediment core samples record major environmental modifications on this harbor. So what the article is about is they'll be looking at pollen and charcoal to see when people first moved into a harbor in Alexandria. And Alexandria is in the far north of Egypt, right on the Mediterranean. And so they're taking a core sample. Now what that means is, let me switch back my view. So what that means is, and you'll see this, the harbor, the area that they're working on is actually underwater. And so they are taking a drill and then taking a core sample. So they're drilling it down, and then they cap it off at the bottom, and they lift it up. And then what you have is a long tube of sediment or dirt. And then they lay it down, and then they look at different sections of it. And so that's what this article is talking about. And they're wondering when people actually started to move into this area. And the abstract says, they're focusing on the time when pollen and microscopic charcoal content changed, how they changed, and why this occurred. So that's what the article is about. Now, I've made a video on how to read the dates. So this particular article mixes a few type of dating systems. So this YBP is years before present. Now, unfortunately for us, it doesn't mean this particular year. It means 1950. So the way you calculate that, and I talked about this in the video, it's 6,000 minus 1950. So about 4,000 BC is 6,000 years before present. And the earliest change, this is in the earlier pre-dynastic period. So pre means before and dynastic means kingdom. So before they had like a kingdom in the Neolithic period, the New Stone Age. And then it goes through, the second pollen change happened at this point. And they're thinking what happened is because of human activity. Anthropogenic, that just means environmental changes done by people. So anthro means people. Okay, so that's what the abstract says. And then you go to the introduction, and then you read this, and you can see, it investigates, the investigation explores pollen and microscopic charcoal from a sediment core, and it could tell us about human settlement. And of course, you'll be reading this entire thing because it's part of the article I'm having you read this week, but so I'll let you do that. But what the next bit of the introduction talks about is that what natural events can happen in the pollen record. And what they talk about is just water flowing in the Nile and then dumping out into areas around Alexandria. Now we'll find out that there isn't really a fresh water source going into Alexandria early on. So they talk about other things like wind patterns can bring pollen and so on. Water displacement into the eastern Mediterranean can also bring in different pollen counts and different sediment samples. And then you go down into the article and it's showing you an overview. I don't think I can write on this, and I don't know if you're seeing my mouse, but the top part, so this is figure A. This is showing you the Nile Delta, so this is the Mediterranean Sea at the top. And then section B of figure 1 is showing you the Eastern Harbor that they're doing their study on. Now, I'll show you this right now so you can see parts of what it looked like a long time ago. If you skip down to the next page, you'll see that everything that they're working on is underwater right now. So this is what it looks like now or in 2009. If you skip up, this is what it looked like. So there are islands in the harbor. People were living on these islands, traveling to the islands, and so on. And so I just talked about anthropogenic pressures. Now, if you look at the PDF I'll put up, I also put these little chat boxes in, and I tell you what these mean. So anthropogenic just means environmental pressures. And then it talks about the focus of the study. The analysis was initiated to determine the dates and whether these changes in pollen and microscopic charcoal changed because of increased human settlement or something else. They're going to describe and interpret these pollen and microscopic charcoal assemblages and then identify these zones that happened after people moved in. And then you've got the section on geographic settings. You can read through that. It just talks about water and temperature and so on. It also, which is important when you're thinking about pollen, so pollen is what's released by plants. It's usually released into the air, and then so wind transport can have, as the article says, a significant sediment source. So what that means is, as pollen is being blown around, it hits the top of the water and then it settles. And it settles onto the floor of, in this case, a harbor, and that's what the sediment source is. So then it builds up over time. And of course, you'll also get sand and dirt and so on being brought up from the Nile and from other sources, which is wind-driven. On the next page of the article, it shows you how close the desert actually is to this area. So this is in kilometers. And with the wind is being driven in this particular area. And then you can see the wave direction too. So what they're trying to do is tell you that, where pollen might come from, where charcoal sediments might be coming from, and all the different things you have to think about. If you go on to the bottom part of that page, they talk about something called the African Humid period. This is when it was rainier in Africa than it is today. And in this particular case, it's about 12,000. In this case, it's BC, before Christ. So 12,000 to 3,500 BC. And then after that, it becomes drier. So during this period, you've got high Nile floods. And then, as you can tell from the article, I hope I don't screw this up. Between 3000 and 1000 BC, there's a huge increase in the population of Egyptians during, just after this. And then the article goes on and talks about what's happening in the Neolithic and pre-dynastic period and what we do know and what we don't know. Okay, and then this is what it looked like quite a while ago, especially when Alexander the Great invaded Egypt. What's important here is that there's a bridge, and the article will talk about this. There's a bridge that goes out to this island. And again, this is underwater right now. And when you think about core samples, you can look at lots of other things too. So for example, you can see high levels of lead content that date to before the first millennium BC. And this could be like natural lead, or it could be people working with that particular metal. Now, here's the important part of what I really want you to understand in terms of the scientific data. So there's a lot going on in this chart, and I'm hoping that I can actually write. I don't know if I can write on this, and I'm I'm sure you can see by my hand here, or this little mouse hand. So what you're looking at is pollen counts and charcoal counts as well over time. So down at the bottom is the earliest part. And then you get these little, again, there's multiple things going on in this chart, but these are the time zones, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But down at the bottom of the chart is the earliest time period. So this is in the Neolithic period. And then as you move up in the core sediments, because as you can see here, the depth is centimeters. So this is the depth of the core that they've taken. So this is the earliest period. And then you get up here to the middle period in this chart, and then the later time period up to the modern period. And so that's what this overall general chart is telling you. So now you want to start concentrating on these black areas. Now up here, there's a lot of scientific names for plants, and what I did was I put these little comment bubbles on what some of these plants are and why it's important. So if you look at like changes over time and ignore these, 1A, 1B, 2A, 2B right now, if you look at the earlier sections of this core, so I hope you notice that there's a large amount of pollen for a specific type of plant, and it's this plant here. I don't know if I can pronounce that, Amaranthaceae. And these are just plants that grow naturally. So you're seeing a lot of pollen counts that grow naturally, and it's the same with all this. So Pinus is pine, which doesn't really exist it's not a native plant to Egypt, at least in the modern period, but you definitely had some pine trees early on, or at least pollen that's coming from somewhere. It might be coming from other parts of the Mediterranean. And then if you look across the bottom, what you see down here is that there's nothing for this particular pollen. Now if you go up, what you see is the vitis, looks like vine. It means grapevines. So you can see grape pollen here, and then there's none down here. And grapes usually indicate, or grape pollen indicates people farming. And so down at this earlier period, you've got natural plants growing. You have no vines, no grapes being grown. And then another important one that I've highlighted over here is cereals. So cereals, now as the article talks about, it's kind of hard to distinguish between a cereal like wheat that people are eating and natural. So they do break it up a little inside here. What you can see is this line here. So somewhere around this particular period, all of a sudden you have cereals present. So what that indicates is agriculture and people growing things. And if you look over, you can see just a little before this, you've got people growing grapes. And as you go up in time, notice this particular area gets reduced, except for a little jump here. It gets reduced over time. And if you look at, say, the grape, there's some increase, but it's pretty steady. Cereals, again, they're having trouble distinguishing between natural cereals and cereals that people actually grow. And then the other thing that you notice here is down at the bottom, this is the charcoal level. Now what they're doing is they're comparing the charcoal to the pollen count. But what's more important is that you can see a big jump in this black area over time. So down here at the bottom, in the early period of Egyptian history, there's no charcoal. Then all of a sudden, you get this big increase in charcoal. It comes at the same time where you've got cereals. It comes at the same time when you've got grapes being grown. Now, charcoal, that is the remains of plants that have been burned. And so sometimes you can get like natural forest fires and so on. Now, of course, in Egypt, you don't have enough forest to burn. So the charcoal is indicating the same thing that's indicated when you think about vines being grown, grapevines. People are growing things. They're also starting fires. Now these could be fires for heating, it could be natural fires. More than likely it's fires for heating. And so you get an increase in the amount of charcoal. And so what this chart is overall is showing you is that in the beginning of Egyptian history, there's not very much agriculture going on, but something is happening around this line, around this particular area. And we'll look at the time frames in just a bit. They're described a little bit later. And so this is how you read a chart like this. Now, it's not so important. Down at the bottom, you've got these scales, and you can see that the scales are a little bit different depending on which type of plant pollen you're looking at. So it's mildly important, but what you should really be focusing on is large areas of black that are changing over time dramatically. So these natural types of plants, there's a lot in the early period, and they get reduced, and at the same time, you get an increase in charcoal, and you get an increase in agricultural products. So that's how you read a chart like this. Now, the article then talks about the human influence on the harbor, and especially what happens during over time. So Alexandria becomes a famous city. Obviously, it's named after Alexander the Great. During that particular time, they talk about water storage, and they built an aqueduct, and so on. Not totally important right now. Now, I showed you on the last chart, you've got 1A, 1B, 2A, and 2B. Let me just go back and point that out. You've got these zones here, 1A, 1B, 2A, 2B. So now what the article does is describes these in more detail. And this is where this article is nice in terms of showing you periods of Egyptian history. So this 1A, and here's the sort of the line that distinguishes between 1A and 1B. It's about 6,000 years before present. Now remember, I told you before present you have to subtract 1950. So just to round up, we'll say about 4,000 years BC. This is in the pre-dynastic period, meaning before they had a dynasty or before they had kings, and it pushes into the Neolithic period. So remember, at this point, you're getting a lot of natural plant growth. And then if you look at the next core sample here, 1B, you're moving up in time towards the present. So you've got about 5,600 years before present, so minus about 2,000 years, so about 3,600 BC. You get, if you remember that chart around 1B, you're still getting natural growth of plants, but a few more things are starting to show up. Then you move into 2A. This is the period of Egyptian history called the New Kingdom, and the late period when things start to fall apart. And then you got the more modern period, 2B, where the Greeks have taken over Egypt, the Ptolemaic period, then you move into the Roman period, and then into the modern. So this is the core sample that they're looking at, and that's how you read these times. So what you have to do in this article, unfortunately, is keep going back and forth. So there's 1A, the earlier period, 1B, where you get into the dynastic areas, and then 2A, you get into the New Kingdom in the late period, and then 2B goes from the Greek-controlled period all the way up to the modern. So you do have to go back and forth on this. And once you read through it a few times, it'll start to make sense. And then what they start to do is they talk about the core sample. And I just went through the time zones that they were looking at. So I've highlighted that if you want to correspond that again to what I was just talking about. And then they look at, which is more important for us, the analysis. So they tell you how it's done. Now you can skip this entire section because the science of how they get the pollen isn't really important for what we want to do. But when you get down to, let's see, what page is this? This is page 75. This is what's more important, the pollen microscopic charcoal zones. This is where they start breaking things down into what they actually found. And I just showed you that in the same chart. So what they're describing here is what is showing in the chart. So in zone 1A, you've got this Amaranthaceae dominating. And let me just show you in the chart here that that's the case. Here's the Amaranthaceae, and it's dominating here. It's much bigger than anything down at the bottom. So that's what they're talking about here. Let me just go back. And what they're showing is there's microscopic charcoal is virtually absent. If you go back to the chart, here's microscopic charcoal, it's absent. So all they're doing is they're describing this chart, which I just did for you really briefly. And then moving into zone 1B, you get this almost the same type of pollen. However, you see that Amaranthaceae they're decreasing. And then you get more of these other pollens that are starting to show up more and more. And then you can also see microscopic charcoal is almost absent. And again, when you think about charcoal, think about humans living in an area and having fires. Then you go to zone 2A, and then you see a big change. So domesticated cereal pollen is present. What that means is people are growing food. And you also see, so vitis, remember, is the vine, the grapevine. And then there are other pollens that show associated with agriculture and soil disturbance. What that means is when people are plowing, they kill off sort of the native plants, and then maybe weeds will start to grow where soil is upturned. You see that these other plants, especially pinus, the pine tree, they're decreasing. So it could be that people are cutting these down. They're starting to grow food, they're disturbing the soil based on the pollen of certain plants, and these natural growing plants are starting to decrease. And then what you see is microscopic charcoal starting to show up. So this is 2A. Let me take you up to the chart here. 2A, and here's the charcoal. You can see a massive increase in the amount of charcoal. So what that's showing you is that humans are inhabiting this particular area, which is Alexandria. Now, what they do is they give you a quick overview, and then what they do here is interpret the data. So what they do is they start talking about what's happening in zone 1A. So remember, this is when you've got natural plants and no charcoal whatsoever. They start talking about why. So they talk about the African humid period again, where you've got more rain, more water flow, and so on. And then it talks about 1B, where you've got the pine trees and so on. More about 1B. And what it's starting to talk to you about is that after the African humid period, where you've got quite a bit of rain, you get moving into when that starts to slow down. So you have a weakening of the rain, the summer monsoons, about 5,500 years BP. Remember to subtract 2,000, so about 3,500 BC. Now, when you have less rain, you get a decreased Nile flow. So meaning the water isn't flowing as much. And then they talk about the pollen changes here in the pre-dynastic or the Neolithic period. And where this is the Neolithic, and we'll talk about this in class, where people start farming. So you see the pollen changes. And then they do the same thing. What's happening with the pollen changes and why. So you can go through all of this, and I've highlighted this. And they continue to do that moving into the modern period. Now, their conclusion, so if you were just picking this article up, you should read the abstract, read a bit of the introduction, and go to the conclusion because it tells you what the article was about. So it tells you the earliest change in these zones according to pollen and charcoal is around 6,000 BP, so about 4,000 BC. And this occurs after you get a bit of drying. So you move out of the African humid period, you've got decreased Nile flow, and so on. And it talks about this is probably when people started to move into this area, especially when things get drier. And that's because we know that there are cereals being grown, there are agricultural weeds, there's grape pollen, and an increase in microscopic charcoal. And again, it says here that's all the first evidence of human activity in Alexandria. And then it goes on to the later period where the Greeks are taking over. So that's how you read this article. Now, an important part too of any article is the literature cited. So if you're interested in pollen counts or microscopic charcoal, there are tons of articles. You can see that the bibliography is almost 3 pages long. So there's a lot of information on this. So if you're interested in this, you'd read this article and say, hey, this is a great topic. Start looking for others. But that is how, let me switch back. So that's how you read this type of scientific article. I'll have quite a few of these articles throughout the semester, and you really need to sit down and concentrate on how to read these. And hopefully what I just went through makes it a little more clear. Usually in history classes, you're not really sort of reading scientific data, but because this class is on sustainability, you really have to be able to read scientific data, understand it, and then interpret it in terms of what you're actually looking for. So for example, this particular article was wondering, when did humans really move into the area of Alexandria or the far north of Egypt? And so the scientific data of pollen and charcoal is telling us it's happening around 1000 BC or so, which is what the article talked about. If you have any questions, certainly send me an email. But what I'll probably do on a quiz is cut out that pollen chart. So let me go back. I will cut this chart out, and I'm going to have you explain it to me. So I have specific questions about what happens at particular times, and I'll just have you explain these. Now, don't worry about the scientific names of the plants and so on. I'll explain everything when I put the quiz together.